Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time you're consuming this piece of educational media. It is me again, your American government instructor, Victor McInnes, coming to you live on tape from my COVID 19 compound located here in the heart of the greater Grovetown, Georgia metro area, the Tech Outpost in lovely Columbia County. Your lecture today is brought to you by your lawn. When was the last time you went out and sat on your lawn? Maybe today's the day. And if you don't have a lawn, go sit on someone else's. Ask permission first. Okay, so today we're doing the final exam review. What I've done is I've gone through all the lecture notes. I haven't gone through the book. I've looked at our prior two tests. And my final reviews are the pool, so to speak, for my lectures where I'm going to be looking to write questions. Your test is going to be 40 questions. 20 of the questions will come from the materials that was covered in the first and second exam. The other half will come from the materials that came after that. Total is going to be worth 150 points. What I'm going to do today, again, is I've looked at, and this is going to be my lecture notes from the entire class. Got lots of pages of notes here, okay? And this will be from the entire class. Again, I'm not giving you the questions. I haven't even written the questions yet. This will just be the kind of things where when I went back and looked at my notes, I said, hey, this could be something I might want to talk about. Excuse me. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to jump all the way back to the very first day of class. We started off by talking about the British traditions that we built our government from. We talked about the Magna Carta Libertatum. We talked about a lot of other key British, Scottish, and Irish and Welsh ideas that went into and contributed to the government that we currently have, or that at least the founding fathers put together in the Constitution. We talked about the run-up to the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, and then to pay for that, we talked about the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Intolerable Acts, and then we got to the end of the war and we talked about what we were left with, and that was 13 separate and sovereign states and a very weak central government that was set up by the Articles of Confederation. We talked about Shays' Rebellion that ultimately brought about the collapse of the Articles of Confederation. We talked about why the Articles failed, and then we started talking about the Constitutional Conventions. We talked about the three great issues that came up. We talked about the tension between the large states and the small states. We talked about slavery as an issue that nobody wanted to deal with. And then we talked about the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. And we talked about the other two compromises, the Virginia Compromise and the New Jersey Compromise. Be aware of all of that. May show up on the test. We talked about what the Constitution ultimately gave us, and that led us into our detailed and extensive conversation about federalism. Okay, we talked about what the Federalists thought they were doing. We talked about what the Anti-Federalists wanted. And then we talked about McCulloch v. Maryland. Now, again, when we talk about court cases, and I mentioned this in virtual office hours the other day, if you see one page with 4 different court cases listed on it, I'm probably not going to be asking detailed questions about those. But like McCulloch v. Maryland, Lopez v. United States, Brown v. Board of Education, Kiramatsu v. the United States, those that I spent a lot of time on, be familiar. Okay, we talked about the progression of federalism. We talked about dual federalism, progressive federalism, the New Deal, and the fact that from the 1980s to today, we're still seemingly in some sort of a transitional period where it's kind of hard to determine what exactly the nature of the federalism is we're experiencing. A little sip of my beverage, which today is Diet Coke. Speaking of the U.S. v. Lopez, we talk extensively about U.S. v. Lopez. Be familiar with U.S. v. Lopez. We talked about how the federal government in the modern age manages federalism, and it's through cha-ching money. We talked about the Morrell land grants. We talked about the other types of grants. We talked about how the United States government leverages, and again, more money, more federalism. Okay? All right, then the next we jump to the Congress, Article 1. Okay? We talked about the 2 houses of Congress. We talked about the House of Representatives, which represents the Vox Populi. Latin phrase, lovely Latin phrase. Be aware of what Vox Populi is and how that ties into the House's purpose. We talked about the Senate, whose original intent was to represent the states. House represented the people, Senate represented the states. Know the differences between the House and the Senate. We talked about the history of the South as it progressed all the way through the rule of the leaders, the members' revolt, all of that. Be aware of all of that. I'm not going to go through it in detail. We talked about gerrymandering. Be aware of gerrymandering. We talked about the congressional constitutional offices, and there are 3 of them. Be aware of those 3. We talked about how the president, when a bill comes out of both houses of Congress and is passed down to the White House, the president has a couple of options. Be aware of those. And then we talked about where most of the work is done in the Congress in committees. And then we talked about congressional member organizations, which are better known as caucuses. Okay? Then we talked about the presidency, the executive branch of government, which is set up in Article 2 of the Constitution. Know the difference between the head of state and the head of government, and the fact that in the United States, our head of state is our head of government. It's really kind of weird. Weird as in most countries don't do it. We talked about what Washington did that was new and different, that sort of set the pattern for presidents that would last for 250 years. Now, a lot of those traditions that Washington set up are now under assault. President Trump doesn't view the presidency that way. Is President Trump wrong? Well, that's a matter of opinion. You know, a lot of people thought Washington was wrong when he left office after 2 terms. But talk about what Washington did that was new. Be prepared to answer questions on that. We talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. We talked about the evolution of the executive. We talked about what a lot of presidents did that were different. We talked about what William Henry Harrison did. We talked about what Abraham Lincoln did as the first industrial president. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster. We talked about Franklin Roosevelt, the mass communicator. We talked about Ronald Reagan, the great communicator who really leveraged mass communication. And then we talked about the reality game show host president that we have now. We talked about the cabinet. We talked about how the cabinet developed. We talked about what the Constitution says about the cabinet. Then we talked about the vice president. We talked about how the vice president is picked, along with a couple of other things about the vice president. Okay, moving on. Next chapter, the bureaucracy. We define bureaucrat and bureaucracy, so know both of those definitions. We talked about how big the government is. We talked about the formation of the first cabinet department and know what the first cabinet department was. We talked about Lincoln and the first real bureaucratic war, the Civil War. We talked about patronage and the spoil system. Be familiar with how the Pendleton Act came to be and what the events were that led up to the Pendleton Act. Be aware also of the Hatch Act. We talked about the modern bureaucracy and the tension between the laissez-faire bureaucracy and the more progressive, more activist version of the bureaucracy that exists. We talked about the cabinet departments, we talked about independent agencies, and we talked about government corporations. Remember, those are the 3 key operatives in the federal bureaucracy: cabinet departments, independent agencies like the EPA, and government corporations. And we talked a lot about the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Then we talked about privatization of government functions. We talked about privatizing the war in Afghanistan. We talked about privatizing prisons, things along those lines. Okay. Then we started talking about the judiciary, Article 3 of the Constitution. Remember, the judiciary, and I'm having trouble saying that today for some reason, the judiciary was supposed to be the apolitical branch of government. We talked a lot about some court cases that really were tremendously important. One of my favorite court cases of all time, Loving v. Virginia. Okay, be familiar with Loving v. Virginia, and also be familiar with the follow-on case to that, which came about 30, 40 years later, Obergefell v. Hodges. Be familiar with Marbury v. Madison. Remember, Marbury v. Madison was the court case that established, confirmed the judiciary's right or authority to act as a check and balances to both of the other branches of government. We talked about the phases of the court's development. And there are several slides on that. We talked extensively about Gideon v. Wainwright. Okay, be familiar with Gideon v. Wainwright. I mean, I spent almost an entire lecture on Gideon v. Wainwright. It's so important. Be aware and be able to answer questions on how a case reaches the Supreme Court. There's a couple of key phrases that go in that as well, like writ of certiorari, all those kind of things. Be familiar with the Article 1 courts that are established under either the congressional Article 1 courts or the Congress is allowed to set up courts for the executive branch. And then we also talked about what happens when a case comes to the Supreme Court, how it's argued, and all those things. Be prepared to answer that. Okay, then we get into the last part of the class. That was on the first two tests. Then we get into the last part, the third phase of the course. Now I'm going to remind you again, lecture notes are really important, but also just to be a jerk, I go back and I pull stuff out of the book just to make sure you read the book. Okay, that's the way college classes work. The professor is going to expect you to both read the book and listen to the lectures. He or she will know what's in the book. And then they'll bring in their own personal expertise to enhance that. And so that's what I've done. So please be aware, if you haven't read the book up to this point, you got about 4 days. Okay? All right, so we talked about civil rights and civil liberties. Know the difference. We talked extensively about Korematsu v. the United States. Be aware of that. It's one of the 3 worst court decisions. Again, remember the other 3 was Plessy v. Ferguson, we're going to talk about in a minute. Korematsu v. the United States, and then the Dred Scott decision. And again, the Dred Scott decision where even if you were in a free state, since a black man, a slave, an enslaved person had no rights as a person, they could be returned to slavery. Again, our triumvirate of horrible cases, Korematsu v. the United States certainly ranks up there. And also, even though it was written by a great jurist, Hugo Black, the opinion is considered one of the dumbest opinions ever written by a Supreme Court justice. We talked about how we have rights in conflict, the right of the public to be safeguarded. Public good versus personal good would be one way to look at it. We talked about that. We talked about freedom of expression. We started talking about all our different rights guaranteed to us under the Bill of Rights and how the government has constantly tried to minimize those, and we talked right off the bat. The Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed by and signed by the guys who wrote the Constitution themselves. Be aware of the Alien and Sedition Act of 1796. Be aware of the Espionage Act. And we talked about Schenck v. the U.S. Be aware of what Schenck v. the U.S. was about. Then we talked about Brandenburg v. Ohio. Again, another important court case. Those are 2 very closely tied cases. We talked about the Bill of Rights in the courts. We talked extensively about Miranda v. Arizona. So be up to speed. You may get a question about Miranda v. Arizona. We talked about we talked about race as a social construct and not a scientific idea. And we saw some quotes by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Great quotes. Go back and familiarize yourself with those. Then we hit we hit 2 court cases that are just really trying as Americans to understand why they would say these things. Plessy v. Ferguson that said that separate but equal was perfectly okay in education or in railroad car passengers, but was applied to the education system. And then Cummings v. the Richmond County Board of Education, which happened right there in Augusta, Georgia, where the court said, "Hey, listen, let's take Plessy v. Ferguson and let's even take the separate part out. You just had to have schools available. They didn't even have to be county run." And again, just a horrible decision, but lesser known because Plessy v. Ferguson was even worse. Okay, then we get to the year 1954, which was the year that so many years of Jim Crow laws, so many years of segregation in the South began to unravel. Starts with Brown v. Board of Education. Be familiar with Brown v. Board of Education. You'll see questions about that. It went to, the next thing that happened was the murder of Emmett Till. Be familiar with who Emmett Till was. We went into civil disobedience in Montgomery with a bus boycott, in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the lunch counter sit-ins. Be familiar with civil disobedience. And then again, one of my favorite cases, because again, I knew some of the places involved, Katzenbach versus McClung. Be aware of Katzenbach versus McClung. Then we talked extensively about civil rights for women and about how it was not, we went over page after page of about how women were given the votes and then they were given in some areas and taken anyway. Be familiar with all of that. United States versus Virginia. Involved the Virginia Military Academy. Be aware of that. And then we talked a bit about affirmative action. Okay? Then we went to Chapter 12, Political Parties. We defined the political parties. We talked about political parties are a natural outgrowth of mature democracies. We talked about political parties in other countries and about how multi-party systems work. We talked about the history of political parties in the United States and about how Thomas Jefferson spoke strongly against the formation of political parties, and then he immediately formed the Democratic Republicans, which was, the Federalists were not really a party. They were just a collective of people who had the same ideas. The Democratic Republicans became the first Republican Party, or the first political party, and then the Federalists formed a political party in response to that. We went through the Jacksonian era where Jackson felt like he'd been personally offended by the Democratic Republicans. So he threw off the mantle of the Democratic Republicans and formed the Republican Party on his own. We went all the way through up to modern day. We talked about why political parties form. We talked about my favorite political party in the world, the official monster raving loony party. We talked about party functions, what they do. They raise money. They get people elected. They give you a brand. They give you a platform. And then we talked about money again. Money. So that and that's one thing that political parties do for you. And then we talked about the two-party versus the multi-party system and the advantages and disadvantages of both. So familiarize yourself with those. Then we hit the last chapter, lucky chapter 13 on elections. We started off by talking about this concept of universal suffrage. Who gets to vote? That's always been up for discussion. We talked a lot about women's suffrage again. We talked about how many people, who gets to vote. We've never had supposedly it's one man, one vote, but we all know that's not true. You guys don't get to vote because you're not 18. We talked about that push and pull of a lot of the definition of our democracy in the history of our republic has been who gets to take advantage of the rights afforded because it's never really been universal. We talked about swing votes and about how many people actually are up for grabs in any given election. We talked about identity politics, and we talked about the fact that it started with the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of mostly minority lesbian Democrats who began the LGBTQ political action committees or political action groups and really sort of pushed their agenda and ideas forward. Okay, we talked about why we should vote and why we do vote. We talked about how presidential elections work. We talked about the road to the nomination for a president in the two political parties. We talked about primaries and caucuses. We talked about political conventions. We talked about congressional elections. And then we wrapped up with a thrilling and interesting conversation about campaign finance law. Okay. Yeah, always end on campaign finance law because that's a hot button. That's just exciting material. Okay, so that's it. Again, I sent out the date when your test is going to go active on Blackboard. You will have 24 hours to get it done. For those of you with statements of accommodation for extra time, I will take care of that. And you will be given the extra time. Generally, for a 40-question test, I will give you 90 minutes to complete it. Okay? So, and that is plenty of time for multiple choice test. Okay? All right. We will be having virtual office hours on Monday. The announcement's been sent out, and I will answer any questions about final exams except for, hey, are you going to ask us about this? Clearly, I'm not going to answer that kind of question. All right, I can't think of what else I need to tell you that if I can't send out an announcement later, so we're going to come in right at 20 minutes here. So stay safe, stay well. Stay 6 feet away from anybody you don't know at least. Just try and don't go out unless you absolutely have to. And we will talk to you on Monday at virtual office hours.